afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Alex Zhang. I'm the Associate Dean for Information Services at Duke Law School. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's faculty author talk. I would like to first express my sincere gratitude to Professor Gina Gill-Fletcher, Associate Dean for Intellectual Life, and her office for generously sponsoring today's lunch. I also want to thank our colleagues in Duke Law Instructional Technologies Consulting, as well as my wonderful partners in the library, Jennifer Behrens and Shauna Bangerol, for their hard work in making this event possible. Today, we're so delighted to celebrate the publication of Professor Matthew Adler's newest book, Risk, Death, and Well-Being, The Ethical Foundations of Fatality Risk Regulation. It is published by Oxford University Press in 2025, and you can always count on the library to provide you with access to the book work, both electronically through our subscription and also a paper copy on our bookshelves. Professor Adler is the Richard A. Horvitz Distinguished Professor of Law and Professor of Economics, Philosophy, and Public Policy at Duke University. And we are also privileged to have Professor Jonathan Weiner moderate today's conversation. Professor Weiner is William R. Perkins Distinguished Professor of Law and Professor of Environmental Policy and Public Policy at Duke University. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Adler and Professor Weiner.
Can you guys hear me? Thank you so much, Alex, Jennifer, Gina Gale, Kerry, Jonathan, and thank you all for coming. Okay, risk, death, and well-being. So I've been obsessed with this idea of prioritarianism, not my term. It's quite a mouthful. It goes back to the late great Derek Parfit, but I sort of have stood on his shoulders for a long time. But prioritarianism, right? We all know about utilitarianism, an idea that goes back to Bentham, right? Just the sum total of well-being, right? A simple summation of well-being. Prioritarianism is like that. But it's, in a way, a kinder, gentler version of that, right? Prioritarianism, rather than simply summing up well-being, it gives priority to those who are worse off, right? Thus, the term prioritarianism, right? So if you like to think about this graphically or mathematically, I do, right? I find that clarifies, right? You can imagine well-being here, right? And rather than just summing it up, right, we're summing up this sort of concave function of it, right, meaning that the line here goes up but sort of bends over, right? And the effect of that is to give priority to the worse off, right? That is, if you think about a given change in well-being, so WL, this is someone at a lower level of well-being, WH, someone at a higher level of well-being, right? And if we have a fixed increment of well-being, right, this delta W, right? If we're utilitarians, right, we're indifferent as to giving it to the one who was worse off or the one who was better off, right? If we're prioritarians, we would prefer for a fixed increment of well-being to give it to the one who was worse off. And by plugging well-being into this transformation function, right, concave, we have that effect, right? Because this thing bends over, right, the effect in transformed well-being that you can see on the y-axis here is bigger, right, if we confer this increment on the worse off one as compared to the better off one. All right, so that's prioritarianism, right? That's one of the things I've been obsessed with for a long time. The other is this idea of the social welfare function, the SWF, right, which, unlike cost-benefit analysis, which we'll get into, which is kind of the dominant policy analysis methodology, right, which measures well-being impacts in dollars or money, but in the US that would be dollars, and sums them up, right? So cost-benefit analysis uses money as the metric of well-being. This idea of the social welfare function is instead to have a direct measure of well-being, right? An interpersonally comparable measure of well-being, right? And to use that as the basis for policy assessment. Using that, you can be utilitarian, you can be prioritarian. Yeah, okay, so I've been obsessed with this for the last 2 decades, written or edited a bunch of books. Couple reactions, maybe initial reaction might be the covers have gotten prettier over time. A second reaction might be a lot of books. A third reaction might be, Adler, you're kind of writing the same book. Yes, but not exactly. So I've been privileged to have an idea that I can sort of keep spinning out. So in this book, almost 20 years ago, with Eric Posner, this was the end of a research agenda where we tried to reconceptualize cost-benefit analysis, right? So the standard view about cost-benefit analysis is in terms of so-called potential Pareto superiority. That is, if something satisfies a cost-benefit test, right, what the winners are willing to pay in money, right, in total is greater than what the losers would accept, right, then we could potentially shift money from the winners to the losers and make everyone better off, right? And what Eric and I said, ultimately in this book was, that's kind of bunk, right? I mean, if you actually compensate the losers so that everyone's better off, that's great. But the mere potential for shifting money from winners to losers such that potentially everyone would be better off, that itself doesn't mean that something's a good policy when the compensation doesn't occur. So in this book, we tried to reconceptualize cost-benefit analysis, not in terms of this idea of potential compensation, but rather as a rough proxy for overall well-being, right? The idea was that the cost-benefit analysis is kind of a rough proxy for overall well-being, right? Because if those who are better off in total are willing to pay more than those who are worse off, that kind of signals that overall well-being increases. But it's only a rough proxy because of what's called the diminishing marginal utility of money, right? Which means that each incremental dollar has less of an effect on well-being as people get richer, right? If you're making $100,000 or $1 million, right, or what have you, right, the incremental dollar is less significant for well-being than if you're making less. And that means that cost benefit is only a rough proxy for overall well-being. So having done all that, I started to think, well, can't we do better? Right? If we what we care about is well-being, both perhaps the total of well-being and its distribution, can't we do better? And that led me to this notion of the social welfare function, which was out there already, certainly in welfare economics. But my contribution, such as it is to try to integrate that with the philosophical literature on well-being. And so in this book, which is kind of the big book, I grappled both with prioritarianism and this idea of the social welfare function. This is kind of an edited volume where a whole bunch of authors looked at lots of different policy methodologies, including cost-benefit analysis, social welfare functions, and many others. This is a more accessible version of the big book, again, both on the philosophy and on this idea of the social welfare function. This is an edited book, Prioritarianism in Practice, PIP, right, where a whole team of people sort of looked at lots of different policy domains, right, taxation, health, climate change, risk regulation, education, right, and looked at the application of prioritarianism and utilitarianism in those domains. And then finally, this book, which is sadly about death and risk. That is the application of these ideas of prioritarianism and the social welfare function to death and risk. Why death and risk? Well, I mean, we're all going to die. But more specifically, you might not think so, but if you step back a bit, fatality risk regulation, right? Policies designed to reduce people's fatality risks. By the way, to reduce fatality risk doesn't mean to reduce the risk of dying ever, right? We're not immortal as far as I know, right? What that means is to reduce the risk of dying in the next period, say in the next year and the next year after that and so forth, right? And by reducing those period risks, right, to increase people's expected longevity, right? In effect, it's reducing the risk of premature death, death earlier as opposed to later, at some cost, right? It's not, costless to do that, but fatality risk reduction, right, is, or as they call it in the book, fatality risk regulation is actually pretty pervasive, right? It's a pervasive feature of modern government. So this is like second paragraph, the introduction, RDW, the book. By fatality risk regulation, I mean governmental policies that seek to reduce the risk of humans of premature death. Happens from lots of sources, right? Toxic substances, radiation, viruses, bacteria, hazardous human artifacts or structures, dangerous activities, natural disasters, other sources, right? And lots of regulatory programs try to address these risk sources, air, water, and soil pollution, food ingredients, contaminants, cigarettes, alcohol, wrecked drugs, firearms, et cetera, et cetera. While I was working on this book, we had a big, not new, but at that point quite salient risk source, pandemics. Right, as if to underscore, the significance of this. Okay, so that's what the book is about. I'm going to, talk for maybe another 10 minutes or so, and then Jonathan and I are going to go back and forth. But just to give you a sense, both about kind of the underlying ethical view and the methodology and the application to risk regulation. So here's just an overview. There is some gobbledygook here. By the way, it is open access. Right, you can, such as it is, right? So that should lower the cost, at least the financial cost, not the time cost, or the annoyance cost, which is there, but at least the financial cost of access to the book to zero. Okay, so this is what the book does. A little gobbledygook here. I'll try to explain it in a second. So working within welfare consequentialism, the book provides a lifetime welfarist account of fatality risk regulation with a particular focus on lifetime utilitarianism and prioritarianism. First works at the level of possible worlds, right? This is ethical foundation, it's the first 3 chapters, and then uses the social work function framework to think about fatality risk policies, right? So this is kind of the underlying philosophy, and this is bringing that to bear in an implementable way, or showing how it could be brought to bear in an implementable way with respect to fatality risk policies. So that's chapter 5, and then chapter 6 is comparing the results of utilitarian and prioritarian. And by the way, I'm not a utilitarian, I'm prioritarian, but because utilitarianism has been kind of a dominant methodology, or at least approach within welfarism for a long time, I'm trying to compare prioritarianism to that, right? So what I do in chapter 5 is to look at both prioritarian and utilitarian evaluation of risk policies, and then chapter 6, I move on to compare that to a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so consequentialism. How many people have heard the term consequentialism? It's a pointy-headed term, right? So it's a kind of the way philosophers talk about kind of the general family of which utilitarianism is a species, right? So the idea of consequentialism, roughly speaking, is to make, to make the world as good as it could be, right? The idea is that the foundation of ethics and trying to decide what to do, we're trying to make the world, the consequences, as good as they could be, right? So, I mean, it's obviously not the only approach to ethics, but it's an important family which goes back to utilitarianism, right? The more precise expression of that is that the foundation of ethics is a ranking, right? A goodness ranking of possible worlds, right? Now that's, again, if you haven't heard this idea of possible worlds, it's a philosophical idea. That's certainly going to be some jargon, but you can think of a possible world as a full, complete specification of one possible way the world might go, right? What might happen fully described, right? And then you can think of a ranking of that, and a ranking of those things as better or worse. And the nice thing about thinking about ethics that way is that you're capturing kind of the intrinsic sources of ethical goodness, right? So you're washing out uncertainty, right? And you're also washing out the fact that some things might be instrumentally good because they lead to other things, right? So thinking about this kind of ranking of possible worlds is a way to capture what are the intrinsically, fundamentally good things ethically, right? Now, of course, we can't actually sort of describe a possible world, right? Even ChatGPT-5 can't do that. But we can think about what are the features of worlds that make them better or worse, right? So this is, the consequentialist enterprise. Welfarism, right, or welfare consequentialism is a specific kind of that. Right? What that says is that what makes, one possible world is another possible world better or worse is well-being, right? The well-being of welfare subjects. Now, in this book, I focus on humans, right? If you care about well-being, humans are not the only welfare subjects. They're, sentient non-human animals. But in this book, just to keep things tractable, I focus on humans. And so, just focusing on humans, what welfarism means is that this ranking of worlds, right, is determined by well-being, right? Ultimately, what matters is the well-being, in this case, of humans, right? That can be captured, axiomatically in terms of these axioms, right? So let me say one other thing. What kind of well-being matters, right? So the book focuses on lifetime well-being for reasons I talk about in chapter 2 and we can talk about, right? So each person has a lifetime well-being, right, in a given world, right, which is determined by how long she lives or he lives, right, and what happens to him and her over their lifespan, right? And then welfarism, and specifically lifetime welfarism, says it's lifetime well-being, right, of this population of individuals and nothing else that determines ethical goodness, right? And that can be captured in these axioms. So lifetime Pareto indifference says if each person is equally well off in world D and world D star, right? Person by person, equally well off in terms of lifetime well-being, then the two worlds are equally good. Anonymity says if we simply rearrange the pattern of lifetime well-being, right? So different people might end up at different levels, but the pattern is the same because we're being impartial, right? Part of the idea here is to have this ranking of worlds be impartial, right? That should not make a difference. And then lifetime strong Pareto says well-being makes a positive impact, not a negative impact, right? If in one world as compared to a second, some people have greater lifetime well-being and no one has less lifetime well-being, that's an ethical improvement, right? So that's, a little more precisely what I mean by welfarism. There are different versions of it. We can talk about this in Q&A. There's utilitarianism, there's prioritarianism, which is my favorite type. There are other types as well. But I like prioritarianism, and I've now, spent a lot of time over and over explaining why. So that's in a way taken for granted in the book. The book, for the first 7 chapters, the book focuses on what I call OHPs, right? Ordinary persons, that is human beings who after birth undergo the typical processes of brain development that lead to acquiring sort of normal psychological properties, right, sufficient to be persons, right, and retain these properties until death. That's not to say, no, obviously there are people who are not OHPs, right? So, for example, adults who, suffer profound dementia, right, at some point lose those properties, right? And that raises special issues, right? Do we really want to take account of them via lifetime well-being, right? There may be difficulties with that. So I talk about those issues in chapter 8, but to focus the analysis until chapter 8, I focused on OHBs. LWB reproducibility, right? This just says, which is just a consequence of welfarism, that death, how does death matter? Well, depending on the ethical framework, death can matter in lots of different ways. If you're a lifetime welfarist, right, death matters because it affects lifetime well-being, right? Why is death a bad thing? Well, you might have lived longer, right? And in a typical case, a lot of additional good might have happened, right? Well-being good might have happened had you lived longer, right? That's why death matters for purposes of lifetime welfarism. Okay, so so basically all this stuff, I go over this. If you found that intriguing, look at chapters 1 through 3. If you didn't, don't. And then the remainder of the book is to really try to bring all that to bear through this social welfare function framework, right, which is a way to implement lifetime welfarism, including utilitarianism, prioritarianism, as well as these other approaches, but I focus, on utilitarianism, prioritarianism. So what's the social welfare function framework? Again, it's a policy methodology, right? There's a model of the actual population, right? We got a set of outcomes. These outcomes are kind of simplified models of possible worlds, right? So obviously policy modelers can't think in terms of complete descriptions of possible realities. So, in this approach and in general in policy analysis, the outcomes are radically simplified. So for example, what an outcome does is to take this population, this model population, and describe basically person by person or cohort by cohort what each person's or cohort's, number one, longevity is, and then some of the welfare relevant attributes. So for example, income or health, right? Obviously well-being depends upon much more than income health, but if we're being policy modelers, we're gonna simplify things that way. Then we have a well-being measure, right? So to take each person's lifetime bundle and convert that into a well-being measure, right? A well-being number. Chapter 4 talks about how to do that. The social welfare function proper, which is some kind of rule, right, for ranking these well-being arrays. So with the well-being measure, right, each outcome is converted into an array, or what's called mathematically a vector, that is a list of well-being numbers for the people. And then we have a social welfare function, whether utilitarian or prioritarian, to rank that. And then finally an uncertainty module, right? Which is, if you think of policies, right, I haven't really said yet how policies, right, policies are basically anything government might do. How do policies fit into these framework? Well, policies can be understood as lotteries over outcomes, right? So the decision maker typically is not going to know for certain, right, what particular outcome will result from particular policy choice, right? But he or she can think of a policy choice as a probability distribution over outcomes, right? And so we're going to need some, component of the framework here, which I call an uncertainty module, right, to rank policies, right, as a function of the well-being measure and the SWF. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, you see why your books are long, because I tend to go on. Not a good thing. Okay, so the favored uncertainty modules, right, that I focus on in this book are simple utilitarianism, right, which is simply ranking policies according to the expected sum of individual well-being, right? You know, a given policy understood as a lottery over outcomes, right? For that policy, we can calculate an expected sum of well-being. And then prioritarianism is the same idea, ranking policies according to the expected sum, not now of well-being, but instead of well-being plugged into this transformation function, right? Now, what's nice about, and I talk about this in the later chapters, is these modules satisfy an axiom of what I call policy separability, which means that rather than thinking of a given policy as a lottery over whole outcomes, which is kind of demanding sort of computationally, each policy can be conceptualized much more simply as an array of lotteries over lifetime bundles, right? So for each person in the population, we can say in the status quo, right, he or she faces a certain lottery over lifetime bundles, and then a policy changes that, right? A policy changes the individual lottery. So for example, by increasing expected longevity and also changing the attributes that the individual has, right? And so, with this axiom of separability in hand, which again is satisfied by both utilitarianism and prioritarianism, or these versions of it, right? We can think of policies as well as the status quo as simply being lists of lotteries over lifetime bundles for everyone in the population. That's a more sort of economical way to think about this. All right. Let me, from these abstractions, let me just put up some numbers showing exactly how this applies to risk regulation, and then we can go to Q&A. Basically applying these ideas to risk regulation, right, we can think as follows, and again, this is true both for utilitarianism and prioritarianism, right? So in the status quo, that's if government does nothing, right? Each individual faces what I call a risk profile and an attribute profile, right? So a risk profile is, for an individual of a given age, it says for the next year and every year after that, right? What's your probability of dying, right? Given that you've survived to that point. So, for example, if you're 50, what's the probability of dying before the age of 51? Conditional on making it to 51, what's the probability of dying before 52? Conditional on making it to 52, what's the probability of dying before 53, and so forth, right? So that's your risk profile. And then we have your attribute profile, which says for each year of life, what are your attributes going to be in terms of income, health, and what have you, if you survive. Now, the nice thing is, if you think about it for a second, given a risk profile and an attribute profile, that implies a lottery over lifetime bundles, right? From a given risk profile and a given attribute profile, we can figure out the person's lottery over lifetime bundles, and we can think of policies as perturbations to that. So in the status quo, we have kind of a baseline risk profile and attribute profile for different people, and then a given policy is a perturbation to that in the sense that it's going to change the risk profile, hopefully improve it, right? So in each year, starting from the present, to reduce fatality risk, but at some cost, right? So there will be a change of the attribute profile in the form of, for example, people have less income. That's the way to capture cost. So that's the basic framework that I use in chapter 5. For those of you who have been exposed to demographics, this meshes smoothly with kind of a standard tool in demographics, which is a survival curve. Right, the survival curve basically says for a population or a subset of the population, right, what is the probability of you surviving each year of life, right? That is kind of the bedrock tool of demographics, right? If you go and look at the Bureau of the Census, they publish those, right? My methodology here basically just applies that, right, and uses that, and to think of policies as changes to these individual survival curves, along with changes to attributes, right? From that, we can look at how expected well-being or expected transformed well-being changes across cohorts. Okay, so, well, let me, okay, there's a lot. Okay, so I'm recalculating here. Applying that to risk, we can think about what is the change in individuals' expected well-being or expected transformed well-being per unit of risk reduction, right? That is, how does utilitarian or prioritarian value change as we change individuals' risks, right? That's, a fundamental part of what I say about risk regulation. And what I do in chapter 5 is to, using a simulation exercise to calculate that. So this is in the simulation exercise in chapter 5 and chapter 6, I imagine a population of 25 cohorts. This is based on actual US data of 5 different age groups, people aged 20, 30, 40, 50, or 60, and 5 different income, so 5 age groups, 5 income groups gives 25 cohorts. And I think about how the value of risk reduction varies across these groups, right? With one meaning the value of risk reduction to a low-income 6-year-old. And I think about how that varies if our approach is utilitarian, and how that varies if our approach is prioritarian, and I compare that to cost-benefit analysis, right? VSL is kind of the valuation tool for cost-benefit analysis. I'll stop there. But what this shows is that, well, not surprisingly, I mean, it shows that you can implement this stuff, right? So this is what governments have been doing for decades, of implementing a cost-benefit approach to risk regulation. I do the same thing for prioritarianism, utilitarianism. It shows that prioritarianism is not just different from utilitarianism, the numbers are different, but that both are different from cost-benefit analysis, right? In a way, vindicating what Eric and I said 20 years ago, which is that cost-benefit analysis, again, this is VSL is the valuation tool for risk, and cost-benefit analysis, is at most a rough proxy for this. And if you like prioritarianism as opposed to utilitarianism, it's quite far from prioritarianism. All right, well, I'm going to stop there, and Jonathan and I can talk a bit and then take your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. That's a terrific and also beguiling introduction to your detailed book, and it's also wonderful to see your passion not only for the all of the world and the social welfare function, but also for each of the details and the careful way that you're trying to analyze all these factors. And so, congratulations. Oh, I've got to do this. Congratulations on this book and on the whole series of books, and really in being at the frontier and pressing the frontier for how we try to evaluate policies, possible worlds, try to understand these policy choices. And I just want to say it's great to have you here, not only for this book celebration, but to have you here as a colleague to advance our thinking on these kinds of topics. So the first question I want to ask you, kind of reacting to the last point, is the broad way of posing this is, how different is what you're describing from the way that policies actually are made today? And maybe a more, and I can think of several examples there. For example, like most US federal agencies use a single number for VSL, for value per statistical life, like something like $10 million per life saved, or maybe it's a little higher now. And they would apply that regardless of income, regardless of health status, regardless of years of life left to live, right? So they don't account for the whole lifetime that you describe. And another way to put that question is, which of the elements of what you're describing do you think real government decision makers could most easily adopt, and which are the hardest, or the ones that you think are, it's going to take the most reform or work to make practical?
Yeah, no, thank you, and thank you for focusing on VSL. So again, it's right. So again, to go back on this idea of SVRR, which is the social value risk reduction. So that's the my valuation concept, right? So it's a change in social value, whether it's utilitarian social value, the sum of expected well-being, or prioritarian social value, the sum of expected transformed well-being per unit of risk regulation, right? VSL, the value statistical life, right, is the CBA analog, right? VSL is the change in cost-benefit value per unit of risk reduction, right? Another way to think about it, right? I see some of my Adler students in here, so as they heard, I took some time in Adler, much to their regret, to talk about cost-benefit analysis in VSL, right? But you can think about VSL as a conversion factor that goes from a small risk reduction to an individual to their monetary equivalent, right? So for example, if VSL is, let's say, $1 million, what that means is that if you reduce someone's fatality risk in the next year by 1 in a million, they're willing to pay $1 for that. If you reduce it by 1 in 100,000, they're willing to pay $10 for that, and so forth, right? So it's a way to translate small risk reductions into monetary equivalents. So very much the analog, the CBA analog to SVRR, right? So yeah, these differ, but as you say, in practice, right, so textbook CBA says that these VSL quantities vary by people, right? Rich people are willing to pay more for everything, including risk reduction, right? So one of the things you'll notice here is that VSLs go up dramatically by income, right? So from 0.9 from 20-year-old with low income to 10.5, a tenfold increase, right? In practice, this is not a pretty thing, right? Governments don't like the notion that we're placing a bigger monetary valuation and risk reduction for rich people. So in practice, as you're alluding to, right, what governments do, at least in the US certainly, is to use just the population average VSL, right? There's no variation at all, right? And this is just the same value. So they're ones everywhere, which is nice on the income dimension. It maybe is not so nice on the age dimension. You kind of think that reducing the risk of a 20-year-old, right, in terms of increasing expected lifespan might be worth more than reducing the risk of a 60-year-old. And I mean, I didn't get to this, but one of the things I do in chapters 5 and 6 is to compare this kind of population average approach to textbook CBA, as well as utilitarianism and prioritarianism, in terms of actual policy valuation, right? What I do in that part of the book is to say, let's imagine a policy that across these 25 cohorts reduces risk by 1 in 100,000 on average, right? What's the break-even cost, the maximum average cost in terms of income reduction that we're willing to pay for that, right? And textbook CBA, utilitarianism, and prioritarianism says, well, it matters whether that risk reduction is born uniformly or whether it's concentrated on the rich, the poor, the young, the old. It also matters how the costs are distributed, right? Population average CBA says none of that matters. The break-even cost is 96 for all these policy variations, which is kind of crazy, I think. So this is, again, a very quick way of responding to the actual practice. How would things have to change? Well, one way to at least approximate this approach is by putting in place distributional weights. And indeed, the Biden administration, so rather than just straight CBA, we put in CBA with weights to kind of offset the effect of income. the Biden administration revised an important CBA circular to encourage that, and then of course that was repealed in January of last year. But I think that would be the thing to, at least the first step towards implementing all this.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. So, so one way, as you say, to make this more operational would be to have equity weights or weights on the distribution in a benefit cost analysis. So that could take account of differences in income or the diminishing marginal utility of money, as you've been, as you've been pointing out since at least the 2006 book. Could that also take account of other differences, so that if prioritarianism is trying to put more weight on the least well-off, that includes not only income but also other life attributes that make people less well-off?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, you can. So if you think of, again, lifetime well-being as a function of longevity, income each period alive, other things like health, right? You could have kind of a combined weight. So cost benefit goes from, it says, okay, we're reducing, let's say, your risk this year. What's your monetary equivalent? And again, that's skewed by wealth, right? Rich people are going to pay a lot more just because money is marginal utility. You can correct that through kind of utilitarian weights, which is in fact what the Biden administration was at least allowing. But you could certainly have a further correction, kind of prioritarian correction for the expected level of lifetime well-being. Yeah,
okay.
You could do that.
So in the social welfare function, as you see it, and in prioritarianism, how are those equity weights set, and who sets them? So that, could it be that one government or one presidential administration would put value on some kinds of distributional equity, and another one would put value on a different kind of distributional equity, or there could be disagreements about which equity to put weight on?
I mean, I would say whoever makes policy choices, and again, this can be done in state governments as well, but the focus here is the federal government. Whoever ultimately makes policy choices in the federal government makes that choice. And that ultimate decision maker for a long time has been the president, right? So ideally, it would be Congress, but Congress, we know doesn't really do much. So it is, so let me say this, it is an ethical choice, right? So okay. Yes.
So here's another way to ask that question. With the distributional weights or the values in prioritarianism to put more weight on those who are least well off, are those kind of theoretically or axiomatically derived, or are they empirically derived in the sense that the way we ask people, the way we get VSL is by observing or asking people for their willingness to pay for risk reduction? So would that also be true of the distributional features of prioritarianism, that we would survey the population or observe people's behavior and see what their preference is for priority or their preference is for fairness? And I guess that, the follow-on question to that is, what if people prefer unfairness?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. No, so I don't think it's a question. I don't think it's an empirical question. I think it's an ethical question. I mean, so you're right. We look to, absolutely. So in estimating VSL, or in general, when estimating monetary equivalence for purposes of cost-benefit analysis, we look, we try to ascertain that empirically. We look at people's actual preferences. But that's because we made a prior choice that well-being is a matter of preferences, right? So in the literature on philosophical literature and well-being, going back all the way to Aristotle, right? There's a profound dispute about the nature of well-being, right? And in fact, I skipped over that, but the book is sort of agnostic about that. So there's, there's one view, which actually was Bentham's view, which says that well-being is not a matter of preference satisfaction; it's a matter of pleasure and avoiding pain, right? Then there's kind of the standard view in economics, which is preference satisfaction, right? Giving people what they want. Then, of course, there's kind of a view that goes all the way back to Aristotle, popularized in our time by people like on different ends of the spectrum, John Finnis or Martha Nussbaum, who say, no, well-being is about realizing various goods, which is not the same thing as, pain and pleasure, not the same thing as preference satisfaction. Once we, or in this case, the economic profession, has made the normative choice to think of well-being in terms of preferences, then it becomes an empirical question, right, what people prefer, right? But underlying that is this normative choice. And then at the level of aggregation, right, how we aggregate well-being to evaluate policies. That is, do we do that in a utilitarian way or a prioritarian way, in a cost-benefit way? I view that as being an ethical choice, right? One of the things that drives me nuts, I love economists. I love the precision of economists. I love the tools of economists. But one of the things that drives me nuts about economics, or some parts of economics, is the view that cost-benefit analysis is neutral, right? It's just neutral, right? We shouldn't depart from neutrality. No, right? Cost-benefit analysis outside economics is intensely controversial, right? And cost-benefit is in play because the president, right, in particular Ronald Reagan, right, followed by George Bush and Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and even still now, and Trump has made the choice to keep in place cost-benefit, right? So that, that's a long-winded way of saying or explaining why I think the decision whether to be traditional cost-benefit, utilitarian, prioritarian, and if prioritarian, the degree of priority for the worse off is an ethical choice, not an empirical choice.
Okay, I would add to that history, of course, Jimmy Carter, who also wanted benefit cost analysis, but also I would say, and then I'm going to shift, but also on the Trump administration, both first and second Trump administrations, that although they kept the benefit cost analysis executive order, they added executive orders that really shift to a cost analysis, which that new rules have to be offset by the cost of reducing the cost of old rules, irrespective of the benefits. So I view that as significant. But let's not dwell on recent presidents. Let's talk about Jeremy Bentham. And I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I think I'm supposed to moderate questions from the floor. So get your questions ready. I'm eager to hear and hear Matt's discussion of your further questions. So at least one more question that I want to propose is about Jeremy Bentham and really about OHPs, about ordinary human persons. Jeremy Bentham, although he may not have considered prioritarianism as you are, but he did consider non-human welfare, and famously said that it shouldn't matter what the color of a person's skin is, whether their welfare is counted, and it also shouldn't matter whether they're human or animal, and he said it in a longer passage. But so I know that you've also been concerned about animal welfare, and you held an excellent workshop here a little over a year ago on how animals could be counted in these different approaches, and you mentioned this in this book also. But so could you expand a little on your thoughts on what steps should or could be made for somehow considering animal welfare in the frameworks that you're describing?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I'm currently on sabbatical, and I'm banging my head against this question. So hopefully the next book is going to be a book on prioritarianism in animals. By the way, animals is really the wrong term. I see dozens of animals in the room right now. We're all animals. Humans are animals. I don't see any non-humans, right? So it really is prioritarianism and non-humans. Okay. That was part of Bentham's insight was that if you care about well-being, it's humans and non-humans both are capable. Basically, all sentient animals, right, are capable of having a well-being. Prioritarianism has generally ignored it. Parford doesn't talk about it. Parford, the pioneer. Here is the puzzle: is that prioritarianism says we should give priority to the worse off, and lifetime prioritarianism says we care about lifetime well-being. But if you apply that to non-humans, right, it seems like typical non-humans are worse off in lifetime terms than even badly off humans, right? Because they tend to live much shorter lives, right? Farmed animals live, I mean, broiler chickens live 30 days, right? Pigs live a couple years, right? And because, it's plausible to think they're quite badly off. And so the puzzle is that it seems plausible and nice that prioritarianism means giving priority to worse off humans as opposed to better off humans. But does that also mean that we're going to priority to, even average non-humans over badly off humans? I mean, that's a serious puzzle. So I have a possible answer, but I'm not going to say what it is. I'm working on it. Thank you, Dean, for allowing me the space to bang my head against. But it's a really important problem. It's a hugely important problem. And part of the import is that, I mean, there is in fact this, back to Bentham, but now there's this big network of people working on animal welfare economics, animated in part by the effective altruism movement. Those folks tend to be utilitarian. Right? And the big question for prioritarians is, well, what is the space for prioritarianism within a concern for animal welfare and animal welfare economics? And how does it deal with this problem of maybe giving a counterintuitive degree of priority for just ordinary animals over even badly off humans? So yeah, that's what I'm working on now.
And I think at least one important message from what you've just said is that in addition to the quantitative calculations and the formulas that your work is replete with, there are these deeply ethical and philosophical questions about value and sentience and the other issues that you've mentioned. Okay, so we have some time for questions, and I see a few. So, Shitong.
Yeah, thank you, and also congratulations, Matt, for this wonderful book. I look forward to reading it in final and also published form, and also it's wonderful to have open access to the book. So could you go back to the slide on the the value of statistical life with the different ages? Yeah, this one. So I understand from the conversation between you and Jonathan that it's not just empirical core, right? It's a combination of empirical, but also like a value judgment and also theories, right? So when I saw like the first one, right, on the top left, right, I don't like it, right? Like, right? Because right, the rich person's life is going to be much more valuable than mine, right? But when I saw the table on the right, at least my understanding is that means actually a life of the low-income person actually more valuable, right, than the person than the value of the life, the top percentage. Right? I'm wondering I like it, but I'm wondering whether we need to go that far, right? Because I would be, as a person, on the left side, right? I would be happy to say, going back to Jonathan's point, like my life is as valuable as Elon Musk's, right? And also from the policy perspective, that would be enough because of the power of numbers. Because the poor people would be the majority, right? That means if you do the benefit cost analysis, just because the majority are relatively poor and the top are really just a minority, the majority will get the policies they want, right? So I'm thinking, why isn't that enough? Why should we go as far as say a poor person's life is actually more valuable than a person's life?
No, exactly. So again, these are generated from actual data, right? On sort of the survival curves of individuals as a function of income. And then I assume for these different income groups that you earn a certain income amount each year alive. Again, that's taken from actual data. And then I think of well-being during that year and then over the whole lifetime as determined by the logarithm of income, right? So that captures declining market utility. And so I put this in here. But yeah, so just quickly, so what's going on in here is that by preventing the death of a younger person, right, the increase in expected lifetime well-being for the younger person is more than for the older person, right? The increase, another way to think about this is the increase in expected lifespan is bigger for the younger person than the older person, right? So if you're age 20, let's imagine that, if you die at age 20, you live for 20 years. If you don't die, your expected lifespan, let's say, is 75. And so the increased expected lifespan is 55, right? If you save a 60-year-old, the increase in expected lifetime might be 20 years, right? So that's why these numbers, if you're utilitarian, go down as you get older, and then they go up as you get richer because, as compared to not being alive during a year, living with a certain amount of income is a good thing, but living with more income is a better thing, right? So you're right. So this is there's kind of an intermediate degree of prioritarianism, right? This gamma here captures the curvature here that can actually neutralize this. So with an intermediate degree, we can actually neutralize things so that it's basically flat across the row and increases or decreases with age. And maybe that's the right view. It's an ethical choice, but that would be kind of an intermediate approach. Yeah.
Dean.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Matt, I'm really glad to hear that you're studying the lifespan of different animals during your sabbatical. I wondered if you could say more about the focus on the risk of death in this book as opposed to the previous books. I was struggling to figure out whether the risk of death ends up trumping other risks in this analysis, or if it's, or what that focus does for you. So like imagine the situation you mentioned about COVID, and you have a higher risk of death for older people and a higher risk, now we know maybe in retrospect, of lack of socialization, loneliness, et cetera, for younger people. Do we quantify that younger people's risk in terms of their health outcomes and earlier death, or do we quantify it in some other way and then we're having to balance the risk of death for some people against risk of unhappy life for other people?
So no, you could you could capture both, right? So so the cost. So by thinking not just in terms of this risk profile, which captures the reduction in fatality risk, but also the change in the attribute profile, right? We capture the non-risk effect of policies, right? So your attributes might be income, but we can also think about happiness as being an attribute, right? Social interaction as being an attribute. All that stuff is going to change. In its principle can be reflected in the attribute profile. It's a modeling question, right? And so that can be balanced. I'm going to say for a given individual or cohort, the change in expected lifetime well-being or expected transformed lifetime well-being will be a function of both things, right? So they're both, sort of channel into the framework, right? Whether you can actually do that, depends upon whether you can model that. But the framework is open to that.
Chris.
Can you say something about the domains of risk and regulation that you think are going to produce the largest variance or cleavages across these different approaches? Like, given that doing something like switching to prioritarianism in these contexts will be both, as we've realized, intellectually, but also perhaps politically challenging and costly, right? Where do we think you're going to have, where's going to be worth putting our emphasis in terms of the domains that are going to generate the biggest gaps in terms of improved welfare relative to the status quo of cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. We're not, so I often, not that you're saying this, but I often get the objection that, well, these are nice ideas, but we can't implement them. It's not feasible. You're not saying that, but I understand. But my response to that straw person will be also my response to you, which is that it doesn't seem feasible because we haven't tried to implement it, right? The reason that cost benefits seem implementable is because we now have decades and decades of work to implement it here. So the same thing with where it matters. Well, I'm not exactly sure. Let's try it out and see. And by the way, one way to try it out is to have agencies do kind of a prioritarian analysis or utilitarian analysis as kind of an alternative analysis, right? So for really big policy choices, let's do traditional cost benefit or population average cost benefit. But let's also do, that with weights, and let's see where it makes a difference, right? I mean, the simple answer is that if we are just affecting a single group, right, then cost, benefit, and utilitarianism are going to converge, right? What drives the difference is variation in marginal utility, and if it's just a group, it's not going to happen. It's where we have, variation in risk effects and income effects across multiple groups that the wedge happens. But I think a lot of policies, have that feature.
Can we take one more and then we'll conclude? Michelle?
So I'm curious, with traditional cost-benefit analysis, it's been, applied to justify this, a more conservative approach to pollution control, for example. And so I'm wondering with the prioritarianism, with cost-benefit analysis, you're weighing the cost to, say, a manufacturer or some sort of production facility and reducing, the pollution against the benefits to a receiving community, an affected community. So how does prioritarianism then take into account that, possible marginal utility of the reduction on the industry itself? Thinking that more, if you have these diminishing values based on income for the individual or for the community, would that not also be applicable to the wealth of the regulated entity? And so I'm just wondering how it would apply on that ledger sheet, on the balance sheet.
Well, and the workers.
Yeah, I mean, so at the end of the day, right, so reductions in, industry revenues to profits are going to be, you want to see those realizes and changes in income of shareholders, workers, and consumers, right? So it's the corporations are not people in this framework, right? So you're going to want to model how that cost impact is borne by shareholders, workers, and consumers, and then as a function of their wealth, you're going to take effect of that. So if, for example, you think shareholders are wealthiest and then consumers and workers, right? If a given cost is borne by workers, you're going to care more about that than if it's borne by consumers, as opposed to, and then as compared to borne by shareholders, right? But just to, so the numbers here get pretty large, right? So the prioritarian, is actually more willing to bear costs. At least in some of these sort of policy variations, than cost benefit or than textbook CBA, right? One way of seeing why that happens is that if you're reducing the risk of someone dying fairly young, from the lifetime prioritarian point of view, dying young is a way to be badly off, right? And you give a lot of, so risk reductions for the young are highly weighted by prioritarianism, right? And to the extent that, pollution reductions reduce risks for the young, they're going to be highly weighted by a prioritarian methodology.
I think we could continue. I think we have to stop there, but let's thank Matt Adler so much and congratulations.